On behalf of the Shultz family, Jim and May, Sister Peggy, Brother Jim, and Brother Eric and his wife Rachel, and the families that are here and the family that is watching online, I welcome you. Also, on behalf of Ron's late mother, Pat, who precedes Ron in death, I'm sure she's very thankful that you're here today as well. If you've not already done so, I'd like to ask you to silence your cell phones just to minimize the distractions. We are here to honor and remember the life of Ron Shultz, a son, brother, co-worker, and friend for many of you. And soon you'll have an opportunity to share your thoughts and remembrances up here in the open mic. And I would encourage you to purpose to celebrate Ron's life by sharing with the family and those that are here later in the service. Let's open in a word of prayer, if you will. Heavenly Father, we are present today in this place to remember and celebrate the life of Ron Shultz, brother, son, friend, and co-worker to many of us in this place. May your presence and power be here with us to comfort us as we gather to remember Ron. Dry our tears, bring joy in our laughter, and help us to connect with one another as we are all on this journey called life that begins with birth and transitions into the mystery of death. A mystery that causes both hope and fear, and yet a mystery that you have revealed in your word, as the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 13:12. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know, even as also I am known. Amen. This time I'd like to invite Eric up, Ron's brother, to share his remembrances of Ron.
I think that's what the word "on" means. The facts and data of Ron's life that was shared in the obituary roughly outlined his education, his career, and his family, but that isn't who he was. Ron was born in Connecticut and moved to Washington at a very young age. His life's path was like many in Washington. He went to school in a small town. He attended University of Washington. I think he actually became fairly tolerant of Wazoo. And that was for a few of you out there that I know who you are too, and ultimately worked for the state. While these facets of life help Ron build perspectives, it didn't define him. Being raised in a farming environment, loving the outdoors, enjoying family and friends, delighting in a good argument, embracing the influence of politics, and wanting to help others is more of who Ron was. He will be remembered for his quick wit, self-depreciating humor, an ability to bring in a relevant movie or TV quote that perfectly captures the moment. The outdoors was always important to Ron. As kids, he and I would build forts and sleep outside at night. It's always fun to look at the stars and talk. However, most of the time, I would wake up in the middle of the night to find he went into the house, into his warm bed. Nothing like being abandoned. As we grew, we would have stick wars. Great memories doing that. Try and get to the higher ground to nail each other. And before paintball, there were BB gun fights. You just had to keep it below the waist, or you'll put your eye out, right? But I will always remember clam digging. One trip in particular highlighted another of Ron's great skills, arguing. Ron, Dad, and I were on our way through Capelas Crossing in a small Ford Ranger bench seat truck. 3 good-sized guys crammed into a hot truck when politics came up. Not a good combination. You see, when it comes to politics, Ron and I were pretty much polar opposites. So when we started at it, the tone in the truck took a turn. Dad was quiet, turned on the defrost on high, and his right foot was pressing down harder and harder and harder. Next thing you know, the flashing lights behind us got us our attention. 60 plus in a 30 in a small town means just one thing, and you could hear a pin drop in that truck for the rest of the trip. Ron and I also enjoy going to sporting events, and I know he continued that tradition with his friends. One great memory was going to the very first Mariners game in 1977. That was also our first time in the Kingdome, and that just blew our minds. It was so much concrete. Pretty ugly, too. Of course, they lost, but we didn't care. We also went to quite a few Sonic games. One in particular was a couple days after I received my driver's license. We drove from Tenino to Seattle Center in a big red station wagon. Remember when I-5 traffic was barely a concern? All I knew is we were a couple of small-town kids living large in the big city. Another great memory is when we went to a Husky football game and we sat in the student section. I was going to Central at the time, which was a great school, but it's tiny in comparison to UW. We had so much fun. It was 1983, so the humor was a little different than now, but the students were just as creative, and I don't think we ever laughed so much. By the way, the score was University of Washington 24, USC 0, and USC beat Wazoo that year 38-17. In respect to Ron, though, I won't mention the Apple Cup score. Yeah, look it up, 1983. The commitment required for continued education definitely fit Ron's passion and mental makeup. I believe this is where Ron really saw his career path and worked towards achieving his goals. As you may know, Ron was a goal setter, as indicated by the numerous lists we have seen in his apartment these past few weeks. Even when his strength was minimal, his intentions to accomplish was much. That is an admirable trait that each of us can desire as we age. One of my favorite phrases is finish strong. As I age and that becomes more meaningful, by the grace of God and the leading of Jesus Christ in my life, I will get to accomplish that goal, finish strong. The pinnacle of Ron's education was graduating with a dual degree from UPS and Seattle U. The degrees are out there if you want to see them. He then passed the bar exam on his very first try. I remember how proud Mom and Dad were of Ron and how strange it was to have a lawyer in the family. Looking back, I wonder if Ron ever considered a domestic violence lawsuit against a particular big brother, me, for the numerous games that we played. I'm just kidding. Ron and I would often enjoy reminiscing how we passed the time as kids. It's just a hoot. As a lawyer, I know that litigation was not something that Ron wanted to do, so he utilized his legal background while beginning his incredible political career. And wow, what a career. Previously, I tried to capture Ron's many responsibilities and accomplishments, but I know I didn't do it justice. I know many of you have great Ron stories and could expand on his career with great appreciation. Ron and I would often talk about similar frustrations with state politics and Boeing. I worked at Boeing bureaucracy, which was I was very familiar with that. It's funny how the names and the uniform colors can change, but the game is still the same. Fortunately, Ron had a real knack for cutting through the smoke and mirrors to get to the core issue. This requires an appreciation for everybody's interests, and I think that was one of Ron's great strengths. Finding a balanced solution might likely make somebody upset, but he had a way of working through that to get to the ideal, sustainable result. Even when Ron was up to his eyeballs with work, he made time for his friends, family, and hobbies. His incredible collection of books, movies, and CDs showed a wide variety of interests. I believe eclectic describes Ron perfectly. You know, it's easier to be eclectic in our music and movies nowadays because we can stream whatever we want, whenever we want, and in multiple platforms. But Ron's collection was before streaming, so that's quite an investment. Ron was faithful to get together with his good friends regularly, and they're here today, and strive to maintain relationships with family, which isn't always easy. I know that I speak for whoever received a Christmas present from Ron, that it was always well thought out and extremely generous. Now comes the hard part, the numerous recent health challenges Ron had to battle. Obviously, we all have various levels of hardship. Some are known by those around us, and others we keep to ourselves. Ron's health challenges were monstrous, but I'm thankful that he brought in others to a certain degree to help him carry the load. Frankly, it was a miracle of God, and I mean a capital M and a capital G. It was a miracle that he survived the many hospital stays and was given 5+ extra years. As was Ron's way, though, he would research out every aspect of what he was going through and often knew exactly what solution best fit his issue. It was tough when the doctors didn't agree, but that was something Ron had to work through. You read between the lines. Safe to say those doctors didn't get many patients like Ron. Another hurdle for Ron was his home life. See, Ron had a great desire for a family. He loved kids, lived vicariously through them, and why did I look up? Lived vicariously through others in this way, yet there was a guard against his heart. He didn't want to be hurt. And who does? It takes risk to open up and be vulnerable in relationship. I believe Ron would say, take that risk. For many, it can be scary to reveal your true heart to others. We tend to convince ourselves that it isn't that important, that others will ridicule or minimize me, or that it really isn't that bad. But you know, deep down, it really is. As I stated earlier, Ron's career was largely based on getting to the core issue of matters. He excelled in his career in understanding each person's needs and had a real knack of getting to a solution that best addressed the issue. But as you know, that can be difficult when it's family, friends, and even coworkers. For many, as life goes on, it seems natural to grow apart, to not stay in touch, and much like the heart, I can convince myself that it isn't that important, but it is. When I think of Ron's legacy, this is one area I know he would want us all to excel in: relationship. Pour into each other, acknowledge past hurts, recognize we are all broken vessels that mess up, confess to one another and ask forgiveness from each other, but be genuine. Only then can we move forward in love, establishing a closeness based on truth, and to finish strong. I truly believe that is what Ron would want his legacy to be. I love you and I miss you, Ron. Mark, you want to come on up? Oh, it's probably Mike, since I said Mark, and it's probably follow the program, okay? Yeah, sorry about that.
If you turn it upside down, Eric, it says no, so that's probably why. Eric was smart. He wrote down his speech. I had a previous one that I read at his funeral. This time I thought I could wing it a little bit. So yeah, hold on to your seats for this. My name is Mike Palich. I had the honor of being Ron's best friend. Those were his words to me and to the many doctors and nurses that cared for him when I'd visit him at the hospital. This is my friend, this is my best friend, Mike. How do you distill a friendship that lasted somewhere close to 50 years? You have to start at the beginning. I met Ron the first time just outside of my house in Tenino, where I was growing up. And across the road was a little triangle-shaped piece of property that had a road, had the streets on the three sides. And we would often go out there and run around the triangle to see who was fastest. I was really fast, really fast. So this new kid's standing there, and I run my lap, and I come in and I'm huffing and puffing. And he looks at me and he says, "You run like a fat man." Those were Ron's first words to me. To this day, I do not forget them. But I've since long ago forgiven him for that. Ron and I became close friends in high school. Sometimes we chased the same girls. He was always an inspiration to me. He was always good in his classes. He worked very hard. When he went through college and I was doing my thing as a volunteer firefighter, we would get together regularly. We would go out to dance bars and try to see if we could meet women. We didn't do very well with that a lot of the time. Over the years, we went to concerts and games together. In 1999, on December 31st, we went up to Seattle for a big event. Last Call Millennial Ball. Multiple bands, food, music, tons of people. Surely we could meet some dates there. the millennial ended up without, any dates that night. The next day we wandered around Seattle and had a good time. We would often go to events and see things that we both liked. The didgeridoo out there, the Native American flute, both of us liked those, so we both got copies, or got the same thing. I have mine, and now I have his. Somewhere in early 2000, we decided we wanted to go see the rock band U2. We had several months to plan for it. We got our tickets. We got tickets for our dates. The problem was we didn't actually have any dates. But we tried for several months. Surely two guys with good jobs, well-dressed, homes, cars, big smiles and enthusiasm could find dates for a concert. We could not. So we went to Seattle to a little bar that was having a pre-party for the U2 concert, and we asked the DJ that was working if maybe she could find some dates for us. No. So we went to the concert with 2 empty seats surrounding us, and we enjoyed that concert. Well, the band came around again the very next year, and we went, we've got like 6 months. Let's get tickets, and we'll have tickets for our dates. 6 months later, we are at Katy Downs in Tacoma, where we like to go quite often. And we were thinking, well, maybe some of these waitresses would want to go to the concert tonight on short notice. No. So we got to the concert, and we found, of course, hawkers outside who would sell or buy our tickets so they could sell them. Like, all right, we'll sell our tickets to them, and maybe they'll sell them to 2 beautiful women, and we will then have our dates. Well, we're in our seats, and we look, and down the line comes 2 other guys. And I'm sure Ron and I both looked at them and went, losers. Ron influenced me in music, in art, in movies, and in food. We would go see movies that I never wanted to see, and I would walk away improved. We'd go to restaurants I didn't really care if I ever ate there, and I would walk away with a new respect for food. The music that I listened to was everything, every piece of music. His music catalog on CDs was alphabetized, but his digital downloads were all mixed, and you could hear the Beatles, followed by Tchaikovsky, followed by Hank Williams. He listened to it all. He loved it all. That influence will follow me the rest of my life and sustain me when I think of Ron. Just 2 guys working their way through life, being best friends, sharing moments, lots of smiles and laughter. And I'm going to miss him so much. And Ron, I still run like a fat man.
That better? Unlike Mike, last week I winged it and he had it written down, and we kind of reversed that now because I was afraid and excited that this would end up looking like a reunion, and it has. Unfortunately, the circumstances is not exactly what I wanted for a reunion. It would have been a lot better if we got together to roast Ron. With Ron here, however, he isn't, unfortunately. But I'm sure I am very thankful, and I don't know how many we have online, but hello out there. And I'm just very thankful for your presence here and the thoughts and seeing all of you, because it just tells me how much Ron meant to all of us as we worked together and played together. You've heard a lot about Ron, and I just want to fill in some of the things you may or may not have known, and then other employees will come up and correct what I've said, because by now, after being retired, I've got it all wrong anyway, so we'll see what happens here. You've heard a lot about his work life and his conservation ethic, and I think too, as Eric talked about, this was a guy that didn't want to be a litigator, and I heard about that early on and how stressful that was, and a lot of that stress was because of the people Ron was dealing with, and I think Ron's heart got in the way. And I think that's hard for a lawyer. It's hard for any of us sometime, but it gave him a better true north of where he needed to go. And good, whether we like it or not, that happened to be politics. And he just glommed onto that. There was a time we can go clear back to Brock Adams and people that he worked with and where he went. Worked with the Audubon, policy advisor to Governor Locke, ended up Department of Ecology, Puget Sound Partnership, and then ended up joining the commission. One of the interesting things under Governor Locke, you may or may not know, and it's good to have Jim Cahill here today because he's the real culprit in all this, is when I got hired at the commission, I got a call from Cahill telling me we were going to fold the commission into the Department of Agriculture. Guess who the policy guy was? It was Ron. But of course, Ron said it was Cahill's fault, and Cahill said it was Ron's fault. So you never got a true story about what happened there. Fortunately enough, that didn't happen. But that's where I met Ron as he became my natural policy advisor from the governor's office. And the one thing that was true about Ron all the way through is you try and get a hold of him, you couldn't, because there were 5 other people trying to get a hold of him, and he was doing more things than he should have been doing, but that was Ron. He just kept pouring things on. And if there was a meeting to go to, that was Ron's favorite place in life. Because of the people and the arguments and the back and forth that could occur there, he loved those sorts of things. Where I really got to know Ron was the Tide Gate legislation. Commission had been given this project up in Skagit to go up there and talk about removal of tide gates and what ought to happen. And they had to have a natural policy advisor go along from the Gov's office to kind of maintain things and to make sure we didn't kill each other for what was going on. So it was Ron. And a lot of those times I got to ride with him. I learned about his life. I learned about how he was with his mom, Pat, and how all that went. And a lot of life stories that I would have never heard if I hadn't had that opportunity. Of course, he'd drive his own car, and then we could stop in Tacoma and have a beer and learn a little bit more before we got home. Well, as things go, governors change. Next governor comes in and says, I want some new folks here. So Ron then ended up in different places. He ended up over the Puget Sound Partnership and was executive director, the interim there for a while, until someone else came in, and about that point in time, Ron was looking for a job, and the commission had just been given in legislation that year to the Department of Farmland Preservation. And so Ron applied. And it was unbelievable, and I think there's a few folks that were in that interview process, the PowerPoint he put forward about farmland preservation and the ethics he had around that and what he had in mind to make that happen. And boy, that got him the job. And what helped with that was I also realized for the first time the commission now had a policy guy. I didn't know how much of a policy guy we had, but we had a policy guy to go from there. and I start jumping around all these sorts of things. What was really clear was the ethic around on conservation. He liked this voluntary conservation thing the commission and all the districts were doing. He saw some benefits in that instead of a regulatory approach, and let's try this another way, and he did everything he could to try to further that. It was always interesting to see him in agency meetings talk about all the resource policy bills in there and just debate back and forth about whether this was a good thing to do or a bad thing to do. He just immersed himself in that all the time. Some thoughts about working with Ron. Don't expect his presentation and work to be done on time. Never was. And there were many times when he was on the agenda still working on his presentation when we were giving the presentations. However, I got to the point I could trust what he was putting together. Smart guy. I don't know that I've ever met a smarter person as far as policy is concerned. Of course, when you spend your nighttime hours watching C-SPAN and TVW, you have to wonder. But that's the kind of policy junkie he was. Eric was talking about a box of Supreme Court cases that were in his house that he read through those docs. So it just tells you how interested he was in the whole political and legal process. Ron pushed hard to expand the commission and the conservation districts. And as I look back on that and what went on, I think it had a lot to do with his perspective of if we don't have an agency that really is doing things and growing and reaching out, it's going to get absorbed. I mean, he watched it happen. He watched this governor go through that. So he continued to stretch the commission. There's a commission member here or two into areas they may or may not have been comfortable with. We got into food policy work, and then we ended up with something called VSP. One of the authors of that is sitting back over here. And the Voluntary Stewardship Program. And Ron's dream was, because there was a point when the counties turned those programs in, when the executive director either had to accept them or deny them. And he was hoping I'd deny one so I could get sued. He was just livid about, this is a bind we need to have Mark in just to see what's going to happen. Thankfully, I retired before any of that ever happened. So it was a good thing. Talk about a guy with vacations. Every year, Lori can attest to this too. Every year, he'd come in and he'd have this amount of vacations, and you can only carry so much over, and you had to have a signature from the director in order to move it forward. And I'd look at him, and he'd swear he'd go on vacations, and the only vacations I really knew about were with Jim and getting out there in that haying. When it was time to hay, Ron was going to take vacation and do that, and then he had stories about that all the way through, Jim, that you can only imagine. And then the other was clamming. If there was a low tide, he'd take a day or two off, and he would go clamming, and you've heard those stories there. The other one trip I heard is when he went back and visited Eric, I believe. And I got to know Eric because of that trip and talked about how that went. He really enjoyed that trip. That was something that meant a lot to him. But he once told me when I was trying to pare his work back that if you want to ever make me mad, just take something away from me. And that's where Ron was. He wanted involvement in everything. And that's kind of how he moved. Trust was a hard thing for Ron, as we've talked about here. It took a long time. Even though he loved being around people, getting close and trusting him, there was only a few of us that he'd let in at a time, and that was after a long, long time of really getting to know Ron really well. The other thing we had going on, of course, was a little bit of cougar and husky tension. Eric, I'm a little disappointed there wasn't some sort of cougar hat back there on the table, but, I can understand. That's just not where Ron was. It got so bad that, and I saw Ray the day after we had the memorial, and we talked about the little wine bet that Ray and Ron had on whether the Cougars or Huskies were going to win. And I still believe there's got to be a wine collection in Ron's house. It's pretty big based on all the wine that Ron ended up having to buy Ray because of all those losses. We did drag him to a Cougar game when they were playing in Seattle, and he was, wore his Husky outfit, was proud to be there. But that was a fun time with him. Dealing with the districts was an interesting issue because we have this group of conservation districts, many of here today, and I'm sure online, that if the commission got any money, their view on that was pass it all down to the districts. It's ours, and we'll put it to good use. We do good things. It was kind of the undertone of that. And of course, Ron would look at that and say, well, we need a couple staff people here, and we ought to have a piece of that pie too. And guess who was in the middle of that food fight most of the time? It was me. And we'd have to kind of talk our way through that. I again believe Ron's view on that was the commission needs to be seen as an agency that's proactive, that's looking over things and has things that need to be done, or the governor's office is going to find another home for you back in the Department of Agriculture again. And I do believe he was right in that sort of thinking. And now that I look and see what the commission has done the last several years, thanks to what Ron's involvement and for all the workers there, you're growing, you're doing great things, and it moves on. So I think that Ron had a lot to do with that. The other favorite thing he had was he invented something called policy meetings with the districts. Anybody here remember those? And the first one happened when I was on a medical leave and came back, and Ron and Ray and Lori wanted to let me know how great this meeting was in Ellensburg they had, and we need to have another one. We kind of stopped for a moment, and I thought, what? And then we started to describe, and so we did. We had another all-hands-on-deck policy meeting, as Ron would call it. And the thing you need to know about that is Ron always had the ideas figured out, because really what he wanted you to do was to believe that these were things that we ought to do. And then we'd get to the meeting, of course, and we'd have some great debaters, Craig is here somewhere, that would say, I don't see it that way. And those were wonderful debates until we got into dot voting. Remember dot voting? It was a Ron Shultz creation too, I think. But Ray hated dot voting. So I had two employees go two different directions on this, and you'd get a bunch of dots and you could vote for your favorite thing. So that was kind of a good thing. But to see us get together and pull the districts in and get that perspective helped create better policies and better work for the state and all around for conservation, from what I say. It kept the agency relevant and helped move things on. The other thing about the ledge session was, and Jim, I think, can allude to this too, Cahill, that during some of the years in there, budgets got really tight. Even the governor's staff got cut back to a degree. And we used to have these weekly legislation meetings with the policy advisors from each agency. It was so important to Ron that he started showing up and running those to let everybody involved just organize it and let's keep talking, because it was another meeting Ron could go to, of course, but he also got to see and work with everyone that was doing that legislation. Personally, it got kind of hard there when he got sick. One of the hardest days was to go up to the UW hospital and see Jim and May there, and I met Eric up there too for the first time too, and had no idea at the first early on what was going to happen. Ron was in a coma and put out, and it was a shock when you see someone that you've worked with and are working with in that sort of condition. And then you started to listen to what the doctors had to say about what was going on. And I have a daughter who's gone through internal med, and she's in a cardiology program. And when she caught on to what they were talking about, she explained to me and said, usually when we treat a patient, there's a way to treat it, a process that's there. That's how doctors learn. Well, Ron had a what-if off the list here that there wasn't such a thing for, and truly went in and they performed miracles, as Eric had alluded to, And Mike and I would get up there, and that's how I met Mike too, and visits up to the hospital just to check in and see if spirits were there. Kathleen would, my wife would go along with me, and a couple of times we had Rachel there. And I got to experience between Kathleen and Rachel talking to Ron, who knew more than the doctors, it sounded like, that were treating him. And oh, by the way, he reminded them that he was a lawyer as well too. So, but it was incredible, and Rachel is probably watching from New York as we speak here, because she's been pretty close to Ron and trying to follow and help understand his condition. She spent a lot of hours up there at the hospital with him. Ron, then, after I retired, I got to go from being a colleague to a friend. And it's that tension of not being able to do that when he's an employee and all that sort of thing is always sitting there. You can be friendly, but it's that, how close do you get? And we'd get pretty close. A couple times we'd meet with Mike over at the Heritage Distillery after he got a job there, because I was informed he needed to get out of the house after he'd retired from firefighting and this and that. So we'd meet Mike, fixing us drinks over at the distillery. And I'd stay in touch with Ron. We'd text, we'd go see him every now and then. He'd come over for dinner, sit underneath the butternut tree, trade stories about what was going on, and it was just great to see him for a few years in there, get up on Mount Rainier, get out in nature again, take pictures, as you all know, the things that we got to see. So the two things, I've left you with one thing that Ron always say, and I want to leave you with the last one. And it was, anytime I was at a meeting, I tended to be one of those guys that was not too politically involved and might say something that wasn't politically correct. And Ron, the policy guy, would quickly stand up and say, what Mark meant to say was this. Thank you, Ron. Love you, man.
Well, this is your turn to brave the microphone. We'd like to invite you up to share your remembrances of Ron. When you come, please tell us who you are and how you're connected with Ron. But I would encourage you to come up, and I know one person out there has to be brave to go first. And if you want to say something, don't be afraid to form a line here, and we'll do that. Oh, there's a video first. Excuse me. There's a video first. Excuse me. Okay, now it's your turn. We would like you to come and share. I'm sure the family would like to hear your memories of Ron. So we have 2 microphones on either side here. So if you'd like to share your thoughts, please come and please introduce yourself and how you're connected with the family. Is there someone who'd like to share? Come on up. There's 2 mics here, so you can both just one defer to the other. They are on.
They are on. Okay. Hi, everybody. I don't know why I just jumped to go first. I don't have anything poignant to share, but I only got to know Ron for 5 years. I worked for the commission, and I do policy work at the commission, and I gleaned a lot from Ron. And the past year and a half, we really started to bond, and I think he started to trust me more. And every time I would text him and say, hey, do you have a couple of minutes to chat? He would call right up, and we would have just the best conversations, and we would talk about work, and he would share his political strategies and philosophies, and we had a good rapport, and we would joke, and he would tell me about, I would tell him about all the podcasts that he needed to listen to and all the shows I thought he would appreciate, and he would always tell me how much he really loved to read and just focus on some topic that he didn't know a lot about, and he just wanted to delve into it and learn everything he could. I remember being in his office, it was pre-COVID, so it was probably late 2019, and he called me into his office, and he was telling me about how he loved going to Google Earth and Google Map and looking at all these different places, and he was showing me, and I had no idea about this, but there are some museums and natural areas, and you can go into the museum and do a virtual tour, and I had no idea, and he was so happy. He was so happy when we were going through the museum together, and I remember just being really struck by how much he hungered to learn more and to be present and do more. And we love to talk about Star Wars. And when I visited him at St. Pete's, I went on International or Intergalactic Star Wars Day on May 4th. And I was so afraid to go into his room because he was sleeping, and I was terrified that I hadn't been able to reach out to him to see if it was okay to visit. And so I paced the hallway and thought, should I go in? I don't know. And the nurse saw me pacing, and she was very kind, and she invited me in and said, well, why don't you just sit? He's sleeping, but you can just sit. And I was making small talk with her, and I was telling her, well, you know, it's Star Wars Day, and I wanted to visit him on Star Wars Day. And she said, yeah, I know. He let me know. He let us all know. And I told her that I was really afraid that I was going to make him feel uncomfortable because I didn't know if he could talk or not, and I didn't want him to feel helpless or unable to communicate with me. And I was sharing that with the nurse because I was really nervous. And she looked at me and she said, what are you talking about? And I said, I'm afraid if he can't talk to me, it'll be uncomfortable. She said, he's been talking all morning. He's been telling me all about Star Wars and all about his health and everything he's feeling and about the views. And I thought, oh, that's Ron, okay. And then he woke up, and it was one of the most touching moments for me to have Ron open his eyes and then close them and go back to sleep, and then open them and close them and then open them and do this kind of double take and see me there. And he was able to talk, and we talked for 15 minutes. And then when I visited him again, we talked for a full hour. And he was so positive, and he was so in the moment. And it was the first time that I'd really started to talk to him where it wasn't, let's talk about work and what's going on with work. It was talking about life and talking about self-care and talking about, I think his chaplain was a Buddhist, had a Buddhist background, and he was learning about that. But he was really thinking about life in general. And when I visited him at Mother Joe's, we talked even more, and we sort of talked about work without talking about work. It was really broad, nothing specific. So technically, it wasn't about work. It was work philosophies. But I didn't want to leave. I had to leave because he was getting tired, and I wanted to be respectful of that. But I think about how kind he was with me. He had so much history with politics and policy, and I'm trying to learn. And whenever I was worried that I was screwing something up, or if I had a question or I wanted to ask him about an approach, I will never forget, and I'm starting to use this now. I catch myself doing it. When I would ask what he thought about something, he would say, "Yep, that's exactly right. That's exactly right." And that was so reaffirming. And he could have been condescending. He could have said, "I don't think that's right at all," or "You shouldn't do it that way." It was just, "Yep, that's exactly right." And it was just really comforting, and I will always appreciate that about him. And I feel so sad, because if I had known he was a U2 fan, I would have talked his ear off, or he would have talked my ear off. We could have, I'm not ready for him to not be here. I'm really not ready for him to not be here. And it's nice to see everybody coming together to celebrate his life and to continue that legacy, because we have to. And I think about how passionate he was about voluntary conservation, and he really instilled his approach and philosophy in bringing people together and not being condescending and not talking over people, but bringing them together and using that diplomatic approach to find that common ground. And I will do my best to continue Ron's philosophy there, and I miss him.
Thanks, Allison. My name's Jim Jeserding. I got to know Ron when I was at the Department of Ag, and I got to tell you, as a former Cougar letterman, the only thing I've heard today that I'm not sure I'm right with was the one that said Ron eventually got to tolerate cougars. I don't think that ever really happened, to be honest. We were basically roadkill, and that was on a good day. So yeah, it's Ron. So I got to know him there, got to know him at the policy office department, but I really got to work with Ron a lot when he was the policy director for the commission, and I was working with the districts, lobbying for the districts. And the thing I will always remember about Ron is in the dictionary next to unbridled optimism is a picture of Ron. I mean, it was funny because I'm kind of genetically a glass half full and it's probably cracked and leaking kind of guy. And Ron was the guy that said, "We don't got a big enough glass. We need a bigger glass. We got more coming in than we can do anything with." So I just remember that, and oftentimes it was unrealistic, and it was good to see Jim Cahill here today because he often had to bring reality and Mark and Ron together, and that sometimes was a little difficult, but unbridled optimism. And as I kind of look around and I see, I retired, 3-4 years ago, I can't remember now, but I remember after 40 years of wearing a tie, it was going to take something special to get me to put a tie on. And so, sorry about that, but I think about Ron, and he was just so much fun to be with. And the optimism that he brought, I look around and I see the collective ditch we've kind of put ourselves in politically. And I thought, we need to have more of that optimism. So he's a great guy and a great person. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. My name's Scott Merriman, and Ron and I had the distinct pleasure of starting our legislative and political career together in 1995. He was with the Audubon Society, I was with the Washington Environmental Council, and a couple of my colleagues are in the room here. 1995 was a difficult time to be an environmental lobbyist. That was the beginning of the year on the Contract of America. And one of the planks was to get rid of as many environmental laws as possible. And speaking of optimism, we had to have optimism, and we had to have hope, and we had to figure out what's the common ground among the various political differences in order to get something done. We learned a lot together, we had a lot of fun, and had a few tears, because it was pretty hard work. Our careers crisscrossed next 25 years. And it's a pretty grateful opportunity to get to work with him, to get to know him, and call him a friend. And I am grateful for that opportunity. And he talked a lot about, oh, I got to go hand. So I said, good luck, have fun. Watch out for snakes.
Hi, my name is Ryan. I was a coworker of Ron's, and I got to know him the last 6 years when I've been working while he was at the commission. And I don't think it really set in for me that he wasn't going to still be at the commission until I had this random question about this odd Department of Fish and Wildlife agency rule, and I couldn't figure out who to ask. I was like, oh, I'll call Ron. And I get my phone open, and I start dialing his number, and that was a hard moment to know that the person who seemed to know everything and know everyone was no longer going to be there to answer those questions, give us the obscure fact about which right fielder for the Mariners 55 years ago did this. He and I were able to bond over Robert's Rules of Order and baseball, and having someone like that who you could talk to about anything and go from who gave so-and-so this much money from the Political Disclosure Commission's last month quarter filings to, you know, which strawberry rhubarb recipe was the best to put in your pie, and I'm going to miss him.
My name is Jim Peters. I'm a Squaxin Island tribal member, and the first time I met Ron was, I think it was in one of his conservation roles. It might have been the Audubon back then, and he was coming and asking the tribes to work on some stuff together and things like that. And I kind of told him, I said, okay, that'd be fine if we see eye to eye on some of these things. And naturally, he thought, well, we should. And in most cases, we did with the conservation groups. But they would always want us to help them sue somebody. And we just don't do that as tribes. We don't sue other people's citizens. Now, we might sue that government, but we don't sue individual citizens of that government. So I got to know him really well. And one of the first couple times that I did meet him, I was going, time out. Let's call time out. And I said, you know Billy Frank Jr., he taught me that we need to get to know each other first before we really start talking business. And so, where are you from? And one of the things we had in common geographically is that I grew up in Yelm and graduated from Yelm. And actually, Yelm and Tenino used to be rivals when we were in the same class divisions and stuff like that. But even when we weren't in sports, we still would, we would wear our Letterman's jacket, go to Tenino when they would have their festivals and try to pick up their girls. And every once in a while, they would feel brave, and I would see a Tenino jacket at Prairie Days in Yelm. But I was trying to think back and how long I knew Ron, and it was probably when I met him right around the early 90s. and then all of a sudden we would run into each other. The when he was at the governor's office and working with him there and me at the tribes. Then I had the opportunity to be nominated by the governor to be on the Conservation Commission. And now he wasn't there when I first started, but it was interesting when he did come over to the commission. He was one of the ones initially that if Mark wasn't in his office, I'd go talk to him, because part of it was mainly when I was the chair, and I was, I think, chair twice for them, and I would be going and using Mark and Ron as a sounding board. Okay, we have this tough issue coming up at the board meeting. You know, how should we try to finesse this through? We know that there's going to be polar opposites on both sides. And one of the things, both Mark and Ron, they would help me walk through those type of things, and then come out at the end that I felt a lot more comfortable and not worried as much going into that meeting, knowing that both of them actually had my back when I was the chair, going forward on a tough issue. And then it was interesting one time going into his office when Mark wasn't there, started right into business. He goes, "Hey, wait a minute. How about those Huskies?" He goes, "Let's talk about some Husky stuff right now." And so we started talking about that, and he reminded me, hey, yeah, we need to have, it doesn't have to be always business. It doesn't have to be always the controversial issues. Just listening to him talk about growing up in Tenino and haying and stuff like that, and like growing up in Yelm, I used to, I actually did hay once, and I had hay fever, and so that was kind of the last thing. I swollen up and sneezed all the time, but I couldn't really relate other than that one time about doing that type of stuff. But as we all both got older and stuff like that, didn't see him for a while. I did hear about his first time into the hospital and stuff, but finally got the chance to talk with him a couple times in the last year or so, and I had just had some health issues too. And so the last couple times that I saw him, we would talk about the surgeries that we had and how much knowledge we know about hearts, because before, for me, it was something that pumped blood and stuff like that, and that's about it. But when you have that type of condition, you start to research things. I'm not a big researcher either, but start looking things up. Okay, what do I need to do? How am I supposed to treat this thing? And when we would get together, that was what we were talking about. We were talking about the stent that I got, and we talked about the ablation. We talked about cardio rehab type of stuff. We did slip in a couple cougar and husky type of stories and stuff, but it hit me hard when I went home, and after I heard about his passing, and I told my wife about Ron Shultz, and she goes, "That name sounds familiar." And I'm going, yeah, for 17 years on the Conservation Commission, I probably a couple times came home frustrating and vented to you sometimes about Mark. But I consider him as a strong coworker, somebody that helped me through when I was on the Conservation Commission through some tough times and things that I had to figure out how to deal with, but ultimately a very good friend that we became. Oh, the other thing too is I would see him in 1,000 different places, mainly up at the legislative type of stuff. And when you see him, it's one of these things where we knew that both of us were busy, and it would be like a little nod type of thing, and we'd walk by, and I'm going in my hearing, he's going into his hearing. But at least once or twice during the legislative session, we found time of saying,
let's get together, let's go have a beer, let's go have a cup of coffee, or let's meet for breakfast since you're going to the same hearing tomorrow morning than I am, and talk a little bit. And I really appreciated that. So thank you.
Hi. Good, it's still on. It's a recurring joke. My name is Corey. Ron was my uncle. If he was here, he'd probably tell you my name was Tater Tot. So if you've heard about me, that could be what he referred to me as. I have one particular core memory of Ron, and it was when me and a friend of mine went out to the farm to help hay. We're from Everett, city boys. Never done anything like that before. We'd take a week or two. I forgot how long we were staying. It might have been 2, but came out to the farm and worked for like 4 days, and if that, maybe, and we were over it. And Ron figured he would help us out and get us out of there for a day. So he took us into Olympia to go see a movie and asked us on the way, what movie do you guys want to see? And we're probably 13, 14. The movie at that time that every 13 and 14-year-old boy wanted to see was American Pie. So we said American Pie, assuming he would be like, your mom will kill me. He didn't. He took us to American Pie. And the best part about it was coming back and hearing him and my mom on the phone. And basically him laughing, but I can hear it's like laughing like this. Ha 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 ha. Mom was not impressed. I thought he was the coolest uncle ever. But we always talked about stuff like that. Him and I are both big on movies, and we would talk about Star Wars and Marvel, Batman, because I'm a nerd, and so was he. He was just the best, and I love him and I miss him.
Hi, I'm Steve Robinson, and with all this discussion about the dogs and the cougars, I had to stand up and say a few words about the ducks. That was part of the discussions that Ron and I often had. And so I worked with him quite a lot up on the Hill. I was Billy Frank's PR guy for 30 years. I worked for the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission for a long time, and then my own business with the tribes. And so we had a lot in common in terms of conservation. You know, we almost always saw eye to eye on just about everything dealing with politics and saving the world. But when I really got to know Ron was when we started something called Boys Night Out. And we'd have a bunch of us guys get together, and we would go to the Rock next to the theaters here in Lacey and order a big, meaty meat pizza. And we'd share that. You know, Ron have a piece or two, so would I. Maybe we'd have a beer. And Boys Night Out was really about the movies. It was going to the theaters to see the movies that our wives really didn't want to see. My wife, anyway. Speaking of wives, I have to talk a little bit about my wife, Gigi, who worked with Ron for many years. And she, you know, he loved her. She's been the rock for, she was on the Puget Sound Action Team and the Pacific Education Institute. And me too. After I retired a few years back, I joined every board imaginable, not necessarily by choice. I just never really learned the word no. And one of them was Pacific Education Institute, which he was the chair of here these last several months. And and he used to chastise me a lot because, you know, he knew I was a duck, and you know he could get away with it. But we spent a lot of time at these Boys Night Out, and I figured once we got into the theater that, you know, since we shared the meaty meat pizza, he'd share his popcorn. Hell no. You couldn't touch this stuff. It was just so scrumptious. It looked so delicious. He had so much butter on it. And we saw all kinds of movies. We saw action films typically, everything from Top Gun to Avatar and that kind of thing. And it went on for years. And that's why I really got to know him and understand this guy with this great personality and an incredible brain was all heart. And so I think it's just ironic that it was his heart that finally gave out. And we were shocked, Gigi and I, when we got word of his passing. And as a tribal person, I just want to wish him very well on his journey to the other side. And I hope that he is working with our tribal elders who have passed up there, sitting around the council fire with them, giving them a hard time and having them realize that he was all heart.
Hi, I'm Sarah Moorhead. I work at a conservation district. I've worked with Ron for a while. I also live in Tenino. I had a beautiful flower dress on this morning and some sandals, and I knew that Ron would give me a lot of crap if I didn't wear my boots living in Tenino, so here they are. I've known Ron for over a decade when I started working at conservation districts. You're welcome, those of you that feel old now. It wasn't until many years later that Ron actually knew who I was. Our organization was going through what some might call slight organizational distress. And the inner circle of trust that Mark mentioned was alive and well, and I was not part of that for a long time. I ended up moving to Tenino, where I have the pleasure of being Jim and May's neighbor. And that did buy me some street cred. I remember going to an annual meeting during the troubled time of TCD, and Ron was having dinner by himself. This was after I got to know Jim a little bit, and he said, "Oh, are you friends with Ron?" And I said, "Not yet, but I'm gonna be." And I saw Ron having dinner by himself, and I said, "Hey, Ron, would you like to join us? Come and sit at our table." And he looked up at me and he goes, "No, thanks." And I said, "All right, I'll try again another day." That was a rough time in our history, and I called Ron a lot. On top of that, he measured our organization's success by how well his dad knew about our programs, which was not well enough at the time. And he said, "You're not doing a good enough job." So I provided a whole lot of handouts and flyers to Jim to take to the Grange. And I think Jim must have put in a good word with me, because those phone calls started coming in the reverse. And Ron would be on his way home from meetings up north, stuck on traffic on I-5, and he would call me and he would ask, "What do you think that political group is really after? What do you think about that organization? And what's the motivator of that?" And so we got to bond because we both know people and we know how to read people. The comment he made about, "You're not doing enough if my dad doesn't know what you're doing," was just the first time I really got to see the tremendous amount of love and respect that he has for Jim, which is something to behold. The first time that I learned that Ron cared about me was towards the end of this troubled period of time when things were really climactic. And he called me and he said, "I think you need to get out." He said, "The ship is sinking and I really don't want to see you go down with it." He said, "You're too good at what you do and I think you need to leave." And I said, "Nope, I'm not going anywhere." And that's what solidified our friendship, was because we're both also really stubborn. And I think the amount of respect that he gained by me pulling my boots up and sticking with it really solidified our friendship. After being neighbors with Jim and May for a long time, I can see why he thinks the world of them. And those are two people that I care very much about and have so much respect for. So I have two children. My son Bryson is 8 and my daughter Freya is 3. I wish that he got to know her because my goodness, hell hath no fury, like that curly-haired girl. And he would have liked that. And he got to follow along with my children growing up just down the hill from where he grew up and running in a similar forest and watching Jim hay our hayfield, and Ron and I really got to bond over that, and I got to hear all of the stories of him being a similar boy running through those woods and haying with his dad, and I think that was a really special part that I'm glad that our relationship got to evolve into, where we got to have that conversation about my children and the experiences that he really valued. And it was really fun to see a different side of him, because certainly working with Ron, I learned a lot about how to speak to an audience, how to have confidence, how to command, how to have that presence, how to be unapologetically yourself. Just to really love what you do. I know a lot of people have said, my gosh, I think he needs to take time and heal, and he needs to leave the commission. He needs to go rest and do something that he loves. And I said, no, I get it. This is what he loves. These are the people that he loves. This is the work that he loves. This isn't a job. This is a piece of him. This is something that he cares about. And I get it. I drank the Kool-Aid too. You know that. I'm sorry. Anyway, needless to say, an impactful human in so many of our lives, and I appreciate that. And I appreciate the reminder to tell people how much we care about them and what they mean, and you guys mean a great deal.
All right, thank you for your thoughts, and I will encourage you later to stick around, look at the memorabilia back there, and visit with the family and each other. I wonder what Ron would think about a cougar doing his memorial service. But I know that Ron and I would be able to agree on one thing, and that is our total disdain for ducks. So, sorry. Death is a mystery. And for those of us who are left behind, it appears to be final. My wife and I work in long-term care, and we have spent many hours with families as they watch their loved ones slip away. And they slip from this life into the next. And it leaves a void behind that only that person can fill. Good friend of mine just lost his wife of 39 years. He was best man in my wedding, and over the course of time, we grew apart, not because of any rift, but just because of time and kids and distance. I moved to Olympia. He lives in Paulsbo. But after wrapping up the affairs of his wife's passing and fulfilling some business contracts that he had, he hit the road. And he went to Utah and then California, and he worked his way up north and landed at my wife and I's place last week. And he stayed with us tonight. And while we were together, he said with a smile on his face, he said, this is a good time to reconnect with family and with friends. And he said, and my wife, to her, heaven was an extremely real place, and that she was ready. And he also asked me what my most most important thought was, or my most important thing of my faith was. And I told them quite quickly, I said, that's easy. It's my hope of heaven. Entering into that rest of new life where I can shed the struggles of this life and live the way God originally created us to live. Perfect in his presence, clean, without sin or temptation, immortal, and in perfect harmony with God. According to the scriptures, God created man and woman and placed them in the garden where all their needs were met. They were eternal beings, perfect, living in perfect harmony with God the Father, their creator, the creator of heaven and earth. And they met with God daily, and they were fully dependent on him for all things. And this was good. There was no evil, no lying, no selfishness, no thievery, no exploitation of others or nature, and there was no death. God gave the man and the woman, Adam and Eve, all their hearts desired, and their desires were good. It was always in harmony with God. They did not have to struggle as we do with a thought of good or evil, and they had no knowledge of such. Whether this is metaphoric or literal, that has been debated over the centuries, but we all have this inherent yearning for a perfect life as expressed in these words, no bad days. A year ago, my mother-in-law turned 80, and we were out at Skamania Lodge, and it was hot, and we were walking around, and I looked at her, I said, Nana, can I get you something? She goes, the 80-year-old Nana, she goes, yeah, I'd really like a beer. So I went and I got her a No Bad Days beer. But the reality is that we do have bad days. The type of life that we all yearn for is just not our reality. You see, in the garden, there's also a tree known as a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And they were told not to touch it or not to eat of it. And if they did, it would bring forth death. Again, this could be debated if it's metaphorical or literal, but what the scriptures teach us about this is that the man and the woman exchanged their immortality that they enjoyed for independence from their Creator. And that they began to choose good and evil for themselves, ignoring what God might have to say about things, and they became mortal, bringing death to all of us and the ills that brings. This mortality that Adam and Eve were cursed with, unfortunately, comes to us because mortals give birth to mortals. And so we find ourselves in this struggle that we are helpless to overcome. But that's not the end of the story. God gives his love for us, or God in his love for us, brokered a transaction through another human, that human being Jesus Christ, who lived a perfect life in mortal flesh, never faulting, as I have done so many times. Jesus lived a perfect, selfless life in perfect harmony with God, his Father, and Jesus accomplished this by living in full dependency upon God. Because Jesus' dependency never faltered, Jesus overcame death and rose again and now offers us help in our time of need. For it says in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 15 and 16, for we do not have a high priest, that is Jesus, who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but in all points was tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we might obtain mercy and find grace to help in our time of needs. I can speak for myself, and I think you would all agree, more than ever, this world needs both mercy and grace. And so God grants us the hope of heaven to all men and women, everywhere, every race, every creed, every color, rich or poor, good or bad. You see, God knows our weakness, and our weakness is revealed in death. So God does not judge us on whether we are good or bad. God simply asks us to understand our human frailty, acknowledge our mortality, and depend upon Jesus for the hope of heaven. For it says in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 10 and 11, For to this end we both labor and suffer reproach, because we trust in the living God, who is the Savior of all men and women, especially those who believe. These things command and teach. Upon receiving such mercy, God simply asks us to love one another. Death is a part of life, but life does not end with death. There is a good that comes from death, and death reminds us of our frailty and helps us to remember to depend upon God and his Son Jesus for grace and mercy. Death also helps us connect with one another, as we are all God's creation. We would all do well in loving and honoring one another and understanding that person that sits next to us is in need of grace and mercy, just as I am. Ron will be missed, especially by those who are closest to him. However, there is a hope that someday you may be reconnected with Ron or others that you have lost and are reminded of because of Ron's passing. My encouragement to you is to make that hope sure, that hope of heaven sure, as my best man's wife did, by transferring the dependency that you have in yourself to depending upon God. God is gracious and he will help you. Let's roll a video. Heavenly Father, we thank you for having known Ron, who connected with so many lives. I pray, Father, that you would comfort those who are hurting due to the loss they feel. Lord, I pray that no one here would despair nor be angry for you at Ron's passing, but they would find comfort in one another and in you. Lord, help us all to depend less upon ourselves and depend more upon you. May we learn to love one another while we still have each other here on this earth to love. Help us to bring a smile to one another's face, just as Ron did for so many people. Teach us to be a good friend and to love our family as Ron did. May you guide our way and give us peace. In Jesus' name, I pray. Once the family has dismissed, then you guys can dismiss yourselves. Again, I encourage you to hang out as long as you would like. Thank you.